Hi there, my name is Mr. Chao and welcome to Chao Time. I've returned with the third and final installment in my 3-part mini-series on older watches in my collection. So here it is, the Seiko 6309 729A. This watch has been in my family for my entire life. My dad bought this in the early 80s before I was born. But I personally have had it for a little over 2 years. It's still going strong, although it's not keeping perfect time, to say the least. The way I review watches is by comparing the watch against a rubric in an objective fashion in the categories of case and bracelet, dial, and movement. I have a final category that is much more subjective on brand, heritage, and prestige. These categories gives me a final total score. And I then take that total score, I apply a value multiplier to get a value score. If you'd like to know more about how this works, there is a video up in the top right hand corner. I then take those two scores and I rank them against all the other watches I reviewed thus far. After all that, I give a completely subjective opinion on the watch based on my personal preferences, how I'm feeling that day, in this particular case, sentimental value, and other types of subjective opinions that I think we all use when we are looking at watches in our own collections. Before we can begin scoring the watch against the rubric, let's first consider the purpose and design philosophy behind the watch. And so this was a professional dive watch, and that's basically what it is. It's a tool watch through and through. So let's get to it. The first category we have is the case and bracelet, and we'll be judging it in feel, function, and visual appeal. This 316L stainless steel case design is the first automatic Seiko diver with this now iconic case shape, as far as I can tell. All surfaces that come in contact with the wrist gently roll to be comfortable. The crown guard is located at 4 o'clock, making the watch wear smaller and more comfortably. The entire design philosophy seems to be predicated upon keeping it tight and compact while housing a movement of this size and having water resistance of 150 meters. The finishing on the case is a bit hard to see at this point, however. The brush tops still show signs of machine marks though, and some of the bevels seem just a tad bit uneven to my eye. The bezel has 60 clicks and is bidirectional, but actually feels amazing for the age. Each click is distinct and authoritative. However, it's difficult to turn, even with this impressive knurling. On the bright side, it shouldn't ever get knocked out of place. The other touch point is the crown, which is generously sized and has deep ridges to improve grip. It twists in and out smoothly, as is expected with the hundreds, if not thousands of turns it's seen in its lifetime. The bezel is two-tone and aluminum. It's seen better days and shows why aluminum bezels typically need to be replaced if worn hard. Nestled within the bezel is a flat hardlex crystal. This one shows some scratches, which goes to show how much softer hardlex is compared to sapphire. The bracelet is from the era, but did not come stock on this watch. I'm not sure if this was one of the bracelet options at the time, so I won't score the watch based on this bracelet. It originally had a black rubber strap, but when it broke, my dad replaced it, and then he replaced it again and again and again for many years until he got tired of replacing straps and bought this bracelet. It's a 5-link design with hollow mid-links. It articulates to virtually any shape and is thus supremely comfortable. As I said, since this doesn't affect the score, I won't spend too much time describing it. The case back has the Seiko Tsunami indicating its use as a professional dive watch. It's rated to 150 meters, which helps it to be an excellent everyday watch. No need to be careful around water here. 6 out of 10 for form, 6 out of 10 for function. Let's move on to that dial. The black dial is completely matte, reflecting almost no light at all. All aspects of the dial are painted on. The indices have this interesting linen pattern under close inspection, a relic of the loom printing techniques of yore. They are all rectangular shaped, with the exception of the 2 right triangles at 12 o'clock. The rest of the printing is solid and fairly sharp, as you can see by the Suwo logo. These classic Seiko hands still have functional loom, although it won't last for long. By midnight, it's almost impossible to see anything that would tell you the time. During the day, however, the combination of high contrast and low reflecting dial make for a highly legible design. The shapes of the indices complement the angles and straight lines of the hands, but clash a little bit with the curvy and rounded nature of the case. I do have to say, I think the classic round indices of the 6309 7040 Turtle would have been a better fit for this case. On the other hand, the dial has a splash of orange that does go well with the red on the bezel. As a package, the dial and case work, but they don't go together quite hand in hand. 5 out of 10 for form, 5 out of 10 for function. And as we move into the heart of this watch, the scores continue to deteriorate. The 6309 movement is hardy and reliable. This watch has only been serviced twice in about 40 years, but to be fair, it doesn't keep great time anymore. It loses about 45 seconds a day at this point, but that doesn't really reflect negatively on the design of the movement. It beats at 21,600 beats per hour, and when new, had a power reserve of 47 hours. There are 2 complications, the date and the day. Other than that, there's not much to say about it. 3 points for function, 2.5 points for form. That comes to 27.5 out of 60, which is quite a low score, but it is to be expected because it's a vintage watch and it's being compared against a modern rubric. So let's get into the last category, the brand, heritage, and prestige. I believe that the Seiko brand sits just outside of the Swiss giants. However, the brand comfortably holds the highest score outside of this luxury circle. That said, I think Seiko has been sliding recently. It seems to be a more common sentiment that the watches are well into a zone of being overpriced, and the brand is losing some of its shine in the enthusiast community. That said, I would be surprised if they weren't gaining more fans than they are losing. Seiko has a variety of interesting achievements, such as battering the Swiss brands in their own observatory chronometer trials, the invention of the first quartz movement, the spring drive movement, and the first automatic chronograph. This particular watch has a long list of progeny, is now sold under the fan-based nickname of the 5KX. The watches from this era are a huge contributing reason to my personal fandom of the Japanese brand. I'll give it a 6 out of 10 for brand heritage and prestige, bringing us to a total of 33.5 out of 70. This slimmer version of the 6309 was produced between 1982 and 1988, but this was an early example, as my dad bought it before I was born, and I was born in '83. It was purchased on a trip my parents took to Japan, making this a JDM watch. It makes me want to go to Japan and buy a Grand Seiko to start a Chao family tradition. The price of these is really hard for me to pin down, since there are a crazy amount of Franken watches sold with the moniker 6309 729A. if you do the proper research and find out how to spot a real one, you will see that 1 out of every 50 is real, maybe even less. I'll use $400 to calculate the value multiplier, bringing it to 1.685 and the value score to 56.48. That means the grandfather of the SKX comes in last out of 15 watches. I believe that makes sense for a vintage watch, as the rubric, as I said earlier, is based on modern watch technologies. The value score, though, sees it coming in at 9th place. So that brings me to my personal opinion on this watch. And I'd like to spend a minute pontificating on the value multiplier and rubric. So the value score for this watch comes in between a couple of Rolexes, and you can buy 20 or more of these watches for the price of one of those Rolex. And it begs the question, are those watches 20 times the value of this one? Are you getting 20 times more watch for your money? And it's so hard to say, because definitely for vintage watches, you're buying something that really can't be captured by the tools that I created for this channel. The rubric doesn't really capture what you get from a vintage watch purchase, and the value multiplier also is really geared towards the diminishing returns of spending more and more money on a watch. For what you're getting in return for that is usually brand recognition, and neither of those things really jives with the vintage watch market. So I'm happy to say that the watch, I think, did pretty well in the rubric and value multiplier system that I've created. And that's nice for me, because I obviously have some sentimental attachment to this watch, and so it's just good to see that the watch turned out so well. And so that brings me to something I haven't really considered yet, which is the value of vintage watches. What are you really looking for in buying when you're buying a vintage watch? And obviously it has nothing to do with the technical specifications, the value of the watch, or what the rubric and the value multiplier are capturing. And so when you're buying a vintage watch, similarly, you're paying for the brand, but also for something kind of romantic about the history or the story that comes along with it. And so anyway, it's just something I've been thinking about now that I've reviewed my third kind of older watch, and how older watches fit into the scheme of my channel and how I'm ranking these watches. And that brings me to my next point, which is the sentimental value of a watch. And I understand better now why people get emotional or a little bit choked up when a piece of jewelry or a watch is passed down to them, because that holds an emotional connection that you can't replicate it with financial means. And it reminds me that money really it comes and goes, but these types of connections, they don't. And if anyone is out there and they've inherited a watch collection or anything really that has a monetary value and they're thinking about selling it, I highly urge you to reconsider, because you may regret it at some point, and it's going to be too late at that point, and you'll have spent the money that you received and you may have nothing to show for it. So just some thoughts. Back to the matter at hand, this watch. I really, really love the case shape. It fits my wrist when I'm making any kind of motion at all. I talk often about comfort and legibility, because I feel like those are two really important aspects of watches for me. And this watch is really, really comfortable. It's a really good size, but beyond that, it just curves in the ways that when you're articulating your hand, where it gets jammed up, it doesn't intrude on your range of motion. I really like this bezel as well. It has a red splash here between the 0 and 20 minute mark, and I think that looks nice. I also really like that the bezel slopes inward towards the crystal. It kind of reminds me of like a jet engine, or like part of an Iron Man costume or something. I just think it looks really cool, and I appreciate that about this watch. Speaking even more about the bezel, I like that it's bidirectional. I think it's kind of a quirky thing, and I don't really ever dive or time dives, so it doesn't matter to me that a bezel is unidirectional. I don't really care that much about that, and because it's so stiff, it never gets knocked out of place. And I know I said in the review that the rectangular indices don't really work with the case, but I personally still like it anyway. However, why is it that this movement is basically at the same specs as some of their newer movements? I think that Seiko has retired the 7S26 movement now in their dive watches, but they may still put them in some of their Seiko 5s. I think that's ridiculous. This watch is from the 80s, and the movement technology is virtually identical. This watch has even a higher power reserve than the SKX 7S26 movement. I think that's crazy. I think that Seiko could be doing a lot more with their movements. Obviously, they made the spring drive, which I mentioned earlier, and I think the spring drive is the best piece of movement technology that's come out in the last 20 or so years. I think the spring drive came out within the last 20 years. It might have come out in the 90s, but so anyway, I'm not really that sure, but I do. I love the spring drive. But come on, Seiko. Come on. You can do better, and you should. So that brings me to the end of this review. Is there anything that you would like to see me review? Or is there anything about the rubric that you would like to see changed? Is there anything about the scoring that you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for making it to the end. Bye, y'all.